4 million rifles, and every one of them second place. That was the record. In 1881, Winchester had already owned the American lever-action rifle for 15 years. The Model 1866 and the Model 1873 had armed the frontier, filled the saddle scabbards, and put a single word, Winchester, onto the side of the gun that most people believed had won the West. The market was not open. It was closed, and it had a name on it. The man who decided to challenge that anyway was not a rifle maker. He had spent his working life building pistols, some of them small enough to disappear inside a closed hand. He made hideout guns. He came to the rifle business 2 decades late, with no cavalry contract, no famous cartridge, and no reason to believe he could take a single sale away from the most recognized firearm in the country. His company spent the next century out-engineering Winchester on the details and losing to it on the name. It gave its rifles a stronger action and a flat-top receiver that could take a scope, and still finished second. It built machine guns by the tens of thousands during one World War, made a fortune, and then watched the fortune evaporate when the war ended. It sold, at a sheriff's auction, for $100. It was bought, it was bankrupted, it was gutted by a new owner who moved the work to a factory that could not build it, and it was bankrupted again. And then something happened that the sales charts never predicted. When Winchester's own factory in Connecticut finally went dark in 2006, and the rifles that carried its name were shipped overseas to be built under license, the second-place company's guns were still coming off an American line. The runner-up outlived the champion. This is the story of the rifles that spent 140 years losing to Winchester and outlasted it, how they were built, who kept selling them, who sold them off, and what every one of those decisions actually cost. Chapter 1. The pistol maker's late start. The man at the center of this story was named John Marlin, and he was born on the 6th of May, 1836, in a stretch of Connecticut farmland near Windsor Locks in Hartford County. That location matters more than a birthplace usually does. Within a short ride of where Marlin grew up sat the beating heart of the American gun trade. Hartford was the home of Samuel Colt. New Haven, a little to the south, would become the home of Oliver Winchester. Marlin was born into the one corner of the country where a boy with mechanical aptitude could grow up to build firearms for a living, because the firearms were being built right there. He took the path the region offered. As a teenager, he was apprenticed to the machinist's trade, and by the time the country tore itself apart in the Civil War, John Marlin was working inside Colt's plant in Hartford, turning out the revolvers that armed the Union. That is the first fact worth holding on to. Marlin did not learn guns from books or from the frontier. He learned them from the inside of the largest handgun factory in America, at the exact moment that factory was running flat out for a war. He learned volume. He learned tolerances. He learned what it took to make thousands of identical mechanical objects that could not be allowed to fail. In 1863, in the middle of that war, Marlin left Colt and set up on his own in New Haven. He was 27 years old. He did not start by challenging anyone. He started small, and he started with handguns, the thing he knew. Through the 1860s and into the 1870s, the Marlin name went on to derringers and pocket pistols and single-action revolvers, the compact, concealable firearms that a private citizen bought for personal protection rather than a soldier carried into a battle. Some of his early single-shot derringers were small enough to vanish into a coat pocket or a lady's purse. These were not the guns that make legends. They were the guns that make payroll. It is worth lingering on just how far those early products sat from the legend Marlin would later chase. Through the 1860s and 1870s, the company's catalog ran to compact, single-shot derringers and small pocket revolvers, guns marketed on exactly the qualities a nervous city dweller wanted: easy to carry, easy to conceal, ready at hand. Some were chambered for tiny rimfire cartridges and built to be tucked into a vest pocket or a handbag. This was the low, unromantic floor of the 19th century gun trade. Personal defense hardware for ordinary people, sold in volume, at modest prices, far from any battlefield or cattle drive. Oliver Winchester was selling the rifle that won the West. John Marlin was selling the pistol a shopkeeper kept under the counter. The distance between those two propositions is the distance Marlin would spend the next 40 years trying to close, and the gap in prestige between them never entirely disappeared. Marlin started at the bottom of the market, and some part of the company's permanent identity as the humble alternative was set right there, in those very first years. And here, the shape of the whole story is already visible. Marlin's first business decision was the cautious one. He did not try to invent a new category or beat an established giant at his own game. He found a market, personal, civilian, concealable handguns, that the big military contractors were not fighting over, and he served it competently, and he survived. That instinct, to enter through the side door rather than the front, would define the company for the next century and a half. The pistol business gave Marlin something more valuable than profit. It gave him a functioning factory, a workforce, and a reputation for guns that worked. By 1870, he was offering single-action revolvers. By the mid-1870s, he had a going concern with his own name on it, on the same New Haven streets where Oliver Winchester's operation was turning the lever-action repeating rifle into one of the most famous products in the world. That word, repeating, is the thing Marlin did not yet have, and it was the thing that mattered. To understand how far behind Marlin stood in the 1870s, it helps to understand what Winchester had already done. The lever-action repeating rifle, a gun that let a shooter fire round after round by working a lever beneath the stock instead of reloading by hand, had been perfected and popularized by Winchester across two wildly successful models. The Model 1866, nicknamed the Yellow Boy for its brass receiver, and the Model 1873, later marketed as the gun that won the West, had together sold in the hundreds of thousands. By the time Marlin seriously considered entering the rifle trade, Winchester was not a competitor to be caught. It was an institution to be survived. A cautious man, looking at that landscape, might have stayed in pistols forever. Marlin did not. Sometime in the 1870s, he made the decision that turned a comfortable handgun maker into a rifle company that would spend a century in a fight it could not win and would not quit. He decided to build long guns. He decided to compete with Winchester. It was, on paper, a terrible idea. Winchester had the head start, the famous cartridges, the distribution, the brand, and the scale. Marlin had a pistol factory and a reputation for careful work. What Marlin understood, and what the next several decades would prove, was that the giant's dominance was not total. Winchester had built its empire on being first and being famous. It had not necessarily built it on being best. And in the gap between most famous and best made, a smaller, sharper company might find just enough room to live. That gap was the entire business plan. It was not a plan to beat Winchester. There was no beating Winchester. It was a plan to be the rifle that the people who looked closely chose instead, the connoisseur's alternative, the shooter's gun, the one that finished second in sales and, its makers would always insist, first in quality. To execute that plan, Marlin needed two things he did not yet have. He needed a rifle worth the claim, and he needed a designer good enough to build a better mousetrap than the most successful gunmaker in America. He would find both. But the first rifle to carry the Marlin name into the field would not even be his own design. It would be a gun he bought. The decision to buy rather than build would establish the company's reputation before it ever fired a shot at Winchester directly, and it would set up the pattern that governs everything that follows. Marlin, the perpetual outsider, entering through the side door, winning on the details, and never quite winning the war. Chapter 2. The Ballard Bet. Before Marlin ever built a repeating rifle, it built a reputation. And it built that reputation on a rifle it did not invent. The gun was called the Ballard, a single-shot rifle designed by Charles Ballard and patented back in 1861. A single shot is exactly what it sounds like. The shooter loads one cartridge, fires it, extracts the empty case, and loads another. It is the opposite of everything the lever-action repeater promised. Where Winchester was selling speed and firepower, the Ballard sold something else entirely. It sold precision. A single-shot action, with no magazine and no complicated repeating mechanism, could be built tight and strong and consistent, and in the hands of a target shooter or a serious hunter, it could put bullet after bullet into the same small spot at a distance that mattered. The Ballard design had passed through several owners and several companies after the Civil War, none of whom had turned it into a lasting success. In the mid-1870s, Marlin took it on. By roughly 1875, the Marlin operation was producing Ballard rifles. And over the years that followed, the company refined the design into a family of precision single shots aimed squarely at the market that cared most about accuracy, competitive target shooters and demanding sportsmen. This was a shrewd move, and it is worth being precise about why. Marlin did not have a repeating rifle to sell, and could not yet challenge Winchester where Winchester was strongest. So instead of attacking the fortress, Marlin planted a flag on ground the fortress did not hold. Winchester's rifles were repeaters built for volume of fire. They were good rifles, but nobody bought an 1873 because it was the most accurate gun on the firing line. The precision target market was open. Marlin took the Ballard, made it superbly, and used it to attach a single idea to the Marlin name. The idea that a Marlin was a finely made, accurate rifle for people who knew the difference. That idea was the wedge. A company that wants to sell against a dominant incumbent has to stand for something the incumbent does not, and it has to earn that reputation before it needs to spend it. The Ballard did exactly that. Through the 1870s and into the 1880s, Marlin Ballard rifles built a name among serious riflemen for quality and consistency, a name that had nothing to do with how many rounds the gun could throw and everything to do with how well each round landed. The Ballard, in Marlin's hands, became a serious instrument. It was offered in a range of grades and configurations aimed at different corners of the precision market, from hunting versions to heavy-barreled target rifles built for the formal shooting matches that were a genuine spectator sport in 19th century America. On the target lines, where competitors fired at small marks across long distances and fractions of an inch decided winners, a rifle lived or died on its consistency, and the Marlin Ballard earned a name for delivering it. That reputation did not come from marketing. It came from results on the firing line, which is the only kind of reputation that sticks among people who shoot for a living or for pride. And it attached to the Marlin name at the exact moment the company most needed a claim it could defend. There is an important business lesson buried in the Ballard years, and it is not the obvious one about quality. The lesson is about sequence. Marlin built its brand reputation first, in a category where it faced no established champion, and only then turned to attack the champion's home turf. It did not launch a repeating rifle into Winchester's teeth as an unknown. By the time it did, the Marlin name already meant something specific to the exact customers most likely to notice a better-built gun. The Ballard was not the destination. It was the reputation Marlin would spend, years later, on a fight it actually cared about. But a reputation for accuracy could only carry the company so far, because the market was moving in the other direction. The money, the volume, and the cultural gravity were all in repeaters. The frontier, the ranch, the lawman, the market hunter, they did not want one carefully placed shot. They wanted many shots, quickly, without taking the rifle down from the shoulder. The single-shot Ballard, for all its virtues, was a specialist's tool in an era that was falling in love with the generalist's firepower. Marlin could own the target range and still watch the far larger market for working repeating rifles march past, with Winchester at the front of the parade. So the reputation was necessary, and it was not sufficient. It got Marlin in the door of the American rifle business as a maker of serious guns. It did not, by itself, put a Marlin repeater in the hands of a rancher who would otherwise have bought a Winchester without a second thought. For that, Marlin needed to enter the repeater market directly, and it needed to do so with a gun that was not merely as good as a Winchester, but visibly, mechanically better in some way a customer could see and understand. Building that gun would require a level of engineering the company did not possess in-house at the start. Marlin the man was a capable machinist and a shrewd businessman, but the rifle that would finally let his company stand toe-to-toe with Winchester came from a different mind entirely. A designer whose patents would give the Marlin lever action the one structural advantage that Winchester, for all its fame, could never match. That advantage would look like a small thing in the 1880s. It would turn out to be the reason a Marlin rifle could do something a Winchester could not, more than half a century later. Reputation had gotten Marlin in the door. It had not yet won the room. To do that, the company needed to out-engineer the most successful gunmaker in America, and it was about to hire the man who could. Chapter 3. The man who out-engineered Winchester. The rifle that let Marlin stand up to Winchester was not really the work of John Marlin. It was the work of a designer named Louis Lobdell Hepburn. And to understand what Hepburn did requires grasping a small mechanical fact that would echo across the next 140 years of this story. When a lever-action rifle fires, it has to get rid of the empty brass cartridge case before it can load the next round. The question is where that empty case goes. On the Winchester rifles of the era, the 1866, the 1873, and the models that followed, the spent case was thrown straight up and out through an opening in the top of the receiver. Top ejection. It worked. Winchester sold hundreds of thousands of rifles that ejected out the top, and for the shooting most people did in the 1880s, it made no difference at all. Hepburn built the Marlin to eject out the side. Louis Hepburn came to Marlin from Remington, where he had been a respected designer and a champion target shooter in his own right. Over his career, he would be credited with more than 20 patents, and the ideas he brought to New Haven reshaped the Marlin rifle from the inside out. The centerpiece of his work was a lever-action design with a solid top receiver, a closed, flat top with no ejection port cut into it that threw its empties out the right-hand side instead. He gave the action a stronger locking bolt. He built it to be lengthened and strengthened to handle bigger, more powerful cartridges. This work ran through a sequence of models across the late 1880s and early 1890s, and it reached its most important early form in the Marlin model, 1893. Hepburn was not a bureaucrat working from a drawing board. He was himself a champion target shooter, a man who competed at the highest levels of the sport and understood a rifle from behind the sights as well as from inside the workshop. That combination, designer and marksman in one person, was exactly the kind of talent a company competing on quality needed, and it is no accident that his advantages were the practical kind a shooter notices rather than the abstract kind an engineer admires. The work moved through a rapid sequence of models across the late 1880s and into the 1890s, each refining the action, before settling into the form that would define the company. At the time, the selling points Marlin advertised were strength and cleanliness. The solid top receiver kept rain, dirt, and debris out of the action, which mattered to a hunter in the field. The side ejection threw the hot brass away from the shooter's face rather than up past his line of sight. And the stronger, lengthened action meant the Marlin could be chambered for cartridges that a comparable Winchester of the same class would struggle to handle safely. Those were real, immediate, marketable advantages, and Marlin sold them hard. But the deepest advantage of Hepburn's design was one that nobody in 1893 could have fully appreciated, because the technology that would make it matter had not been invented yet. A rifle with a solid, flat-topped receiver and side ejection has a clear, unobstructed top surface. Decades in the future, when hunters began mounting telescopic sights on their rifles as a matter of course, that flat top would be the natural, obvious place to attach a scope. A rifle that ejected out the top could not easily do this. The scope would sit right in the path of the flying brass, or block the ejection entirely. Hepburn's decision, made for reasons of strength and weather in the 1890s, quietly built into every Marlin lever action the one feature that would let it survive a revolution in how Americans aimed their rifles. Hold that thought. It comes back. For now, what mattered was that Marlin finally had it, a repeating rifle that was not a copy of a Winchester, but a genuinely different and arguably superior machine. The company could now walk into the repeater market and make a claim it could actually back up. Not as good as a Winchester, better sealed, stronger, cleaner to shoot, built by a champion marksman who understood what a rifle was supposed to do. For a company whose entire strategy depended on being the discerning shooter's alternative, Hepburn's design was exactly the weapon it needed. And still, it was not enough to change the ranking. This is the hard truth that runs underneath the entire Marlin story, and it appears for the first time here, in the moment of the company's greatest early engineering triumph. Marlin built a better lever-action mousetrap, and America kept buying Winchesters. The reasons had nothing to do with the guns. Winchester had the head start of a generation. The distribution network, the advertising budget, the cartridge names everyone already knew, and above all, the brand, that single word that had become shorthand for the entire category. A great many buyers did not want the best lever-action rifle. They wanted a Winchester, because a Winchester was what a lever-action rifle was called. So Hepburn's genius bought Marlin a permanent, respectable, profitable second place. The company would spend the coming decades as the choice of the shooter who looked past the name to the machine. And there were always enough of those shooters to keep Marlin alive and building. There were never enough of them to make Marlin first. That was not an engineering failure. It was a branding reality, and no locking bolt or ejection port could fix it. The Model 1893 and its descendants gave Marlin something to build the next century on. But the moment Marlin proved it could outdesign Winchester, it also ran headlong into the problem it could never engineer its way out of. The problem of the cartridge, the problem of the name, and the problem of a market that had already decided what to call the gun it wanted. Marlin had won the argument about which rifle was better made. It was about to discover that the argument it had won was not the argument that sold rifles. Chapter 4. The Cartridge Trap. There is a way to lock a customer to a product so completely that a better competitor cannot pry him loose, and Winchester had mastered it. Marlin never did. That single difference, more than any question of engineering, explains why one company was the champion and the other was the eternal challenger. The trick is the cartridge. A rifle by itself is only half a system. The other half is the ammunition it fires, and the specific cartridge a rifle is chambered for is not a small detail. It determines what the shooter has to buy, over and over, for the entire life of the gun. Winchester understood this early and built its business around it. When Winchester introduced the model, 1873, it chambered it for a cartridge it controlled and promoted, the 4440, and it sold that cartridge everywhere its rifles went. The genius of the arrangement was that the same round could be fired in a Winchester rifle and in a Colt revolver, so a man on the frontier could carry one type of ammunition for both his long gun and his sidearm. One cartridge. One thing to buy. One thing to run out of. That convenience bound the customer to the cartridge, and the cartridge bound him to the world Winchester had built around it. When Marlin brought out its own lever-action repeaters and revolver calibers, including the Model 1894, it faced a decision that reveals the whole strategic bind the company lived in. It could try to launch its own proprietary cartridge and spend years and fortunes trying to convince the market to adopt it against the entrenched Winchester rounds. Or it could simply chamber its rifles for the cartridges the market already used, the same 3220, 3840, and 4440 that Winchester had made standard. Marlin chose the second path. Its 1894 was built to shoot the rounds people already owned. On its face, that was the sensible decision. It removed a barrier to purchase. A customer did not have to commit to a new and unproven ammunition supply to buy a Marlin. He could shoot the same box of cartridges he was already buying. But look at what that choice gave away. By chambering its rifles for Winchester's cartridges, Marlin surrendered the single most powerful tool for holding a customer. There was no such thing as ammunition loyalty to Marlin, because Marlin's rifles ate the same food as everyone else's. A man who owned a Marlin and a man who owned a Winchester walked into the same store and bought the same box off the same shelf. Nothing about the ammunition tied him to the brand on his rifle. The clearest illustration would come with the cartridge that defined the whole class of guns, the 30-30. When smokeless powder arrived in the 1890s, the 30-30 became the defining deer cartridge of the American lever-action, and both Winchester and Marlin chambered rifles for it for generations. But look at the name. The round is known, universally, as the 30-30 Winchester. Marlin's own best-selling rifle would spend decades as one of the most popular 30-30s ever built, firing a cartridge that carried its rival's name on every single box. Every time a Marlin owner restocked his ammunition, the name on that ammunition was, as often as not, Winchester. There is no starker picture of the cartridge trap than a Marlin hunter feeding his Marlin rifle rounds named for the competitor. Marlin made the gun. Winchester, in effect, had named the food it ate. This is the cartridge trap, and it defined Marlin's competitive position for a century. Winchester competed on a locked-in system. Buy the Winchester rifle. Buy the Winchester cartridge. Stay inside the Winchester world. Marlin competed on the open market of the gun itself. The Marlin is better made, so choose it, for the shooter who happened to care. The first strategy holds customers whether or not the product stays superior. The second strategy has to re-win the customer with every single purchase, on the merits, forever. It is exhausting, and it is fragile, and it puts a permanent ceiling on how large the challenger can grow. The consequence was that Marlin had to be better every year just to hold the ground it had. It could never coast on lock-in, because it had no lock-in. Every rifle it sold had to out-argue a Winchester on quality, on strength, on the cleanliness of that solid top action, on the accuracy that the Ballard reputation had established. The moment a Marlin was merely as good as a Winchester and no better, the customer had no reason not to buy the famous name. Marlin's entire existence depended on maintaining a visible margin of superiority in the product, because the product was the only thing it had to sell. Winchester had a brand and a system. Marlin had a gun that had to keep proving itself. For a long time, Marlin managed exactly that. The Model 1894 and its siblings were excellent rifles, and they sold steadily to the shooters who valued what they offered. But steadily is the key word. Marlin sold well. Winchester sold famously. The 1894 was a fine rifle bought by people who had looked closely. The Winchester was the rifle bought by everyone who had not. And in a mass market, the people who do not look closely will always outnumber the people who do. There is one more turn of the screw in the cartridge trap, and it points forward to the modern age. Because Marlin chambered for common cartridges and competed purely on the merits of the gun, its fate was tied with unusual tightness to the quality of its manufacturing. A company that survives on lock-in can let its quality slip for years before customers, trapped in the system, finally revolt. A company that survives purely on being better made has no such cushion. The day its quality falls is the day its only competitive advantage disappears. Marlin, more than almost any gunmaker in America, could not afford to be built badly, because being built well was the entire reason to buy one. That fact would lie dormant for over 100 years. Then, in the 21st century, a new owner would move Marlin's production to a strange factory, the quality would collapse, and the cartridge trap would spring shut with a vengeance the founders could never have imagined. For now, though, Marlin had found a way to live inside the trap. It could not lock in customers with a cartridge, so it would do the next best thing. It would go where Winchester's cartridges could not follow, into calibers so big and so powerful that the famous rifles simply could not chamber them. If Marlin could not win on the ammunition everyone shared, it would win on the ammunition only Marlin could handle. Chapter 5. The 45-70 nobody else would build. If a giant has taken the center of the market, one of the few reliable ways for a smaller rival to survive is to take a piece of the market the giant has decided is too small, too specialized, or too difficult to bother defending. Marlin found exactly such a piece, and it was defined by a single number, the 45-70. The 45-70 was a large, powerful cartridge, a big, fat round originally adopted by the United States Army in 1873 for its single-shot service rifle. It threw a heavy lead bullet with authority, and it was the kind of cartridge a hunter wanted when the animal on the other end was large and dangerous and needed to be stopped rather than merely hit. It was also, mechanically, a demanding cartridge for a repeating rifle. Its size and power required an action long enough and strong enough to feed it and contain it safely, and the standard lever actions of the era were not built for it. Winchester's celebrated Model 1873, the gun that won the West, could not handle a cartridge of that class. It was designed around the smaller revolver-style rounds, and that was where it lived. Hepburn's engineering had given Marlin an action that could be scaled up. Building on the same solid top, side-ejecting design principles, Marlin developed a larger, stronger lever action capable of digesting the big cartridges, and it reached its definitive form in the Model 1895. Here was a Marlin lever-action rifle chambered for the 45-70 and other large cartridges of that family, a repeating rifle that could throw a heavy, powerful round as fast as a shooter could work the lever, in a caliber the most famous lever-action in the country simply could not offer. This was the side-door strategy in its purest form. Marlin was not trying to outsell Winchester in the enormous mainstream market for medium-caliber lever guns. It could not, and it knew it. Instead, it identified a specific, valuable niche, the big-bore, heavy-hitting, repeating rifle for serious, large-game hunting and hard use. And it built the best gun in that niche, in part because the market leader had chosen not to compete there at all. Where Winchester's dominance was total, Marlin lost. Where Winchester was absent, Marlin could be first. The business logic here is worth stating plainly, because it is one of the few genuinely winnable moves available to a permanent number two. A challenger cannot beat the leader where the leader is strong. A challenger can own the ground the leader has abandoned. The 45-70 lever gun was ground Winchester had effectively conceded, and Marlin planted itself there and stayed. That big-bore niche would remain a Marlin stronghold for well over a century. In fact, when the company was finally reborn in the 21st century under new ownership, the very first rifle chosen to announce its return would be a modern descendant of that same big-bore 1895, chambered for that same 45-70, 126 years after the original. The niche Marlin claimed in the 1890s was still, in the 2020s, the ground the company chose to plant its flag on. Some decisions echo for that long. The stronghold was not a straight line, though, and the twists in it deepened the point rather than soften it. The original big-bore 1895 did not stay in production forever. In the difficult years around the First World War, it was discontinued, and for decades the big-bore lever gun essentially vanished from the American market. By the mid-1960s, the old 45-70 had faded so far from current production that a lever-action shooter who wanted serious stopping power had nowhere in the catalog to go. And so Marlin did something it had almost never done in its entire history, the one thing the cartridge trap had always denied it. In 1964, working together with Remington, Marlin introduced its own proprietary cartridge, the 444 Marlin, and a new rifle to fire it, the Model 444. The 444 was essentially a greatly lengthened relative of the 44 Magnum, stretched nearly an inch to deliver power in the neighborhood of the old 45-70, driving a heavy bullet at well over 2,000 feet per second, and generating on the order of nearly 3,000 foot-pounds of energy. For once, Marlin had a cartridge that was genuinely its own, a round that carried the Marlin name on the head stamp. It was the exception that proved the rule. The company had spent 70 years chambering other people's cartridges, and the single time it finally minted one of its own, it did so not in the crowded center of the market, but out in the big-bore niche where it had always been strongest. Then, in 1972, Marlin reintroduced the Model 1895 itself, chambered once again for the very 45-70 it had pioneered nearly 80 years earlier, and the stronghold was fully restored. The niche did not merely endure, it was rebuilt. Twice, because it remained the one piece of ground the giant never came to take. But a niche, by definition, is not the whole market. The 45-70 rifle was a triumph of positioning, and it was also, inescapably, a specialist's gun. It gave Marlin a defensible stronghold and a loyal following among big-game hunters and heavy cartridge enthusiasts. It did not, and could not, make Marlin the general rifle of the American shooter. That title belonged to Winchester, secured by fame and cartridges and the sheer momentum of being the name everyone knew. Marlin's genius was in finding the profitable corners. Its limitation was that a company built on profitable corners is still, by design, a company that has given up the center. Through the 1890s, this was the shape of the enterprise John Marlin had built, a reputation for accuracy inherited from the Ballard, a superior action designed by Hepburn, a flagship repeater in the mainstream calibers that competed on quality it could never afford to let slip, and a big-bore stronghold in the cartridges Winchester would not chamber. It was a clever, durable, well-engineered business. It was permanently, structurally, second. And it was about to lose the one man who had built it, at the exact moment it needed steady hands the most. Because in the summer of 1901, John Malin Marlin ran out of time. Chapter 6. The Founder Runs Out of Time. On the 1st of July, 1901, John Malin Marlin died in New Haven, Connecticut. He was 65 years old. He had taken a boy's apprenticeship in a Connecticut machine shop and turned it into a firearms company that carried his name and competed, on quality if never on volume, with the most famous rifle maker in the world. What he had not done, what almost no founder does well, was guarantee that the thing he built could survive him. The company passed to his two sons, Malin Henry Marlin and John Howard Marlin. On paper, this was the natural and orderly succession that every family business hopes for. The founder's sons, raised in and around the business, took the controls of the enterprise their father had spent nearly 4 decades building. There was no hostile takeover, no bitter fight over the estate, no outside raiders seizing the moment of the founder's death. The Marlin family held the Marlin Company. The name on the door and the name on the ownership were still the same. But succession is a business decision, not a biological event, and the transfer of a company from a founder to his heirs is one of the most dangerous moments in the life of any firm. The founder carries things that are almost impossible to transfer: the relationships, the instinct for the product, the hard-won understanding of exactly which corners can be cut and which cannot, the reputation that is in some real sense personal. When John Marlin died, all of that walked out the door with him, and what remained was a company, a factory, a workforce, and 2 sons who now had to run a business in one of the most competitive manufacturing sectors in America against an entrenched giant without the man who had navigated it from the start. The Marlin sons did not preside over an immediate collapse. The company continued to build rifles, and the product line their father and Hepburn had created, the 1893, the 1894, the 1895, the accurate single shots, remained good and remained in demand. For a decade and more after the founder's death, Marlin carried on as what it had always been: the respected, second-place lever-action maker, selling to the shooters who valued its work. Continuity, in the short term, held. It is a pattern that repeats across family firms in every industry. The founder is the person who took the risks, made the market, and carried the whole enterprise in his head. The next generation inherits the results without having lived the struggle that produced them, and however capable they are running a company they received rather than one they built. Some rise fully to it. Many preside, honorably and quietly, over a slow softening, not a collapse, but a gradual loss of the specific edge that only the founder ever truly had. The Marlin sons were not failures. They kept a good company running for well over a decade after their father's death. But the sharp, founder-driven instinct that had carved out a defensible position in the shadow of a dominant rival was, in the nature of these things, not entirely theirs to inherit. The danger in a founder's death is rarely the sudden crash. It is the slow drift, the gradual loss of the specific judgment that made the enterprise sharp, and above all, the vulnerability that sets in when a company is no longer steered by the person who understood in his bones why it existed. A firm in that condition can run for years on momentum and still be quietly fragile, still be, without anyone quite deciding it, for sale. The heirs of a founder face a question the founder never had to ask, because the founder would never have entertained it. Is this company something to be run, or something to be sold at the right moment for the right price? That question would be answered within a generation, and the answer would not be the one John Marlin would have given, because a war was coming, the largest and most industrialized war the world had ever seen, and that war would do 2 things to the Marlin Company in quick succession. First, it would make the family, briefly, rich beyond anything the rifle business had ever offered by turning the New Haven factory into one of the great weapons plants of the age. And then, when the guns fell silent, it would leave the company gutted, overexpanded, and financially exposed, with the founder's sons cashed out and gone, and the Marlin name in the hands of men who had bought it as a wartime investment and had no idea how to run it in peace. The machine gun boom was about to arrive, and the boom would nearly kill the company that John Marlin spent his life building. Chapter 7. The Machine Gun Fortune. The most dangerous thing that can happen to a company is not a disaster, it is a windfall. A disaster forces discipline. A windfall invites the kind of expansion that only makes sense while the windfall lasts. Marlin's windfall was the First World War, and it very nearly finished the company off. When war engulfed Europe in 1914 and then drew in the United States in 1917, the demand for weapons became almost unlimited. Not sporting rifles, machine guns, the industrial killing tools of trench warfare, needed in quantities that peacetime factories had never contemplated. And a company that knew how to machine metal to fine tolerances, in volume, was suddenly sitting on top of one of the most valuable capabilities in the wartime economy. That was exactly what the Marlin plant was. Around the middle of the decade, control of the company changed hands. The Marlin family sold out, and the enterprise was reorganized under new ownership as a much larger industrial concern, one built to chase the enormous opportunity the war represented. Under the Marlin Rockwell name, the operation transformed from a maker of sporting rifles into one of the largest machine gun producers in the world, turning out automatic weapons for the United States and its allies. Among its most important products were machine guns adapted for a brand new kind of warfare, aircraft guns, mounted on the fighting planes that were then being invented in real time over the Western Front. In 1917, the expanding operation absorbed another arms maker, the Hopkins and Allen Company, folding still more manufacturing capacity into the war machine. The numbers were staggering by the standards of the old rifle business. A company that had spent decades selling lever actions a few at a time to hunters and target shooters was now producing military automatic weapons by the tens of thousands. The money that flowed through the plant during those years dwarfed anything the sporting goods trade could generate. For a brief, intense period, the Marlin name, now attached to a war industrial giant rather than a family rifle shop, was riding one of the great manufacturing booms of the age. And this is the moment to say clearly what a wartime boom actually is, because it is easy to mistake it for success. A wartime boom is not a business winning in the market. It is a business being handed, temporarily. A fire hose of government demand that exists only as long as the war does. Every dollar of expansion built to serve that demand, every new machine, every enlarged building, every added worker, every financing arrangement taken on to scale up fast, is an asset perfectly matched to a customer who is guaranteed to disappear. The war creates the demand, and the war ends the demand. And the calendar of that ending is not set by the company. It is set by the armistice. The armistice came in November of 1918, and the fire hose was shut off. When a war ends, the orders for machine guns do not taper gently. They stop. The government does not need tens of thousands more automatic weapons the month after the fighting ceases. It needs none, and it may well be sitting on warehouses full of surplus. Every arms maker that had scaled up to feed the war now faced the same brutal arithmetic in reverse. The enormous capacity built for the boom became an enormous burden in the bust. Plants and machinery and obligations sized for a level of demand that had vanished overnight, with nothing like it to replace them. For the reorganized Marlin enterprise, the transition from war to peace was not a return to the comfortable old rifle business. It was a fall. The company, that had been one of the largest machine gun makers in the world, now had to figure out how to survive selling sporting guns again, carrying the financial and physical bulk of a wartime giant on the revenue of a peacetime specialty manufacturer. The two things did not fit. The founders' sons, who might have understood how to run a lean rifle company, were gone. They had sold their stake and stepped away. In their place were owners and operators who had bought into a war boom and now held the wreckage of it. The early 1920s were, accordingly, a period of decline and financial distress for the company that carried the Marlin name. The wartime structure could not be sustained on peacetime sporting sales, and there was no obvious path back to the modest, durable rifle business the founder had built. The enterprise drifted toward insolvency, weighed down by everything the boom had left behind. The aircraft gun is worth pausing on, because it shows how completely the company had transformed. Early combat aircraft posed a peculiar engineering problem. A pilot wanted to fire a machine gun straight ahead, but a spinning propeller sat directly in the line of fire. The solution the era arrived at was a gun that could be timed, or synchronized, to fire only in the instance when a propeller blade was clear of the muzzle. The Marlin-built guns were among the automatic weapons pressed into this role in American service. Mounted on aircraft and on early armored vehicles, a family rifle company from New Haven, now building the guns of mechanized, industrial war. It was as far from the target range and the deer woods as a firearm could possibly get, and the money that came with it was correspondingly enormous. It is one of the quiet ironies of this story that the single most financially dramatic chapter in Marlin's history, the machine gun fortune of the World War, did not build the company up. It nearly destroyed it. The rifle business the founder created was small, unglamorous, and durable. The war business that briefly replaced it was enormous, spectacular, and fatal. John Marlin had built a company designed to survive on being a little better than Winchester, year after quiet year. The men who came after him had traded that for a fortune that lasted exactly as long as the shooting did. By the early 1920s, the company was headed for the auction block. The Marlin name, the New Haven factory, the tooling, the designs Hepburn had drawn, all of it was about to be sold to satisfy the debts. And the man who would buy it was not a gunmaker, not an industrialist, and not an investor looking for a war windfall. He was a businessman who saw a going concern that could be had for almost nothing. What he paid for the entire Marlin firearms enterprise has become one of the most repeated figures in the company's history, and it is worth pausing on, because it captures exactly how far the great machine gun boom had brought the company down. He paid $100. Chapter 8. The $100 Company. The number is so small it sounds like a mistake. $100 for an entire firearms company? The name, the factory, the machinery, the designs, the whole going concern. But the number is real, and understanding it correctly explains almost everything about the difference between what a company appears to be worth and what it is actually worth at the moment someone has to buy it. The man was Frank Kenna, and the date was the 4th of February, 1924. The company that carried the Marlin name had gone under, its assets bound up in debt and headed for disposal. And at a sheriff's auction, the kind of forced sale that happens when a business can no longer pay what it owes, Frank Kenna acquired the Marlin firearms operation for the price of $100. But that $100 figure, taken by itself, is misleading in a way that matters, and the real story is in what came attached to it. Kenna did not walk away having spent $100 to own a firearms company free and clear. Along with the assets, he assumed the company's mortgage, a debt reported at roughly $95,000. That is the true price of the Marlin Company in 1924. Not $100, but $100 plus the obligation to make good on $95,000 of debt that had helped sink the previous owners. The $100 headline is the part people remember. The $95,000 mortgage is the part that made it a gamble rather than a gift. This is what a distressed asset actually looks like. The dramatic auction price is nearly zero because the thing being sold is so burdened with debt and so short of buyers that almost no one will touch it. The real cost is the liability that rides along with it. Frank Kenna was not getting a firearms company for $100. He was betting that he could take a debt-crippled, war-battered manufacturer and run it well enough to service $95,000 of obligations and still come out ahead. That was the wager. The $100 was almost a technicality. And here, the pattern that opened this whole story closes a loop. The man who saved the Marlin Company was not a gunmaker. Frank Kenna came from outside the firearms trade, a businessman, not a rifle designer, not a machinist, not a soldier. He acquired the company the way an investor acquires a distressed asset, seeing value in a wreck that its previous owners could no longer manage. Look back at how this story began. John Marlin, the founder, was a pistol maker who came to the rifle business as an outsider to the giants who dominated it. And now the man who rescued Marlin from the grave was an outsider to the gun business entirely. Twice now, the company had been made or saved by someone who did not belong to it. It would happen a third time before the story was done. What Frank Kenna brought was not gunsmithing. It was management, capital discipline, and a willingness to run the company as a business rather than as a war profit vehicle or a founder's monument. Under Kenna and the family that followed him, the enterprise did the least glamorous and most valuable thing a company can do after a near-death experience. It shrank back to what it was actually good at. It stopped trying to be a war industrial giant and returned to being a maker of sporting rifles. The durable, unspectacular, second-place lever-action business that John Marlin had built and that the machine gun boom had nearly destroyed. That return to fundamentals is the whole lesson of the Kenna acquisition. The company had almost died, not from doing what it was good at, but from being swept into doing something enormous that it was not built to sustain. Frank Kenna's contribution was, in a sense, to undo the boom, to strip the company back down to the modest, focused rifle maker it had always been underneath, and to run that business steadily enough to pay off the debts that had come with it. It was not a dramatic strategy. After the drama of the machine gun years, undramatic was exactly what the company needed. What Frank Kenna started, his family continued. And the continuation is the part that mattered most. Ownership stayed inside the Kenna family across generations, and with it stayed a particular temperament, conservative with money, patient with the product, uninterested in the kind of bold expansion that had nearly killed the company once already. This is the least celebrated virtue in all of business and one of the most valuable. An owner who knows exactly what the company is and is content to let it be that, year after year, without reaching for something grander. The Kennas did not try to turn Marlin into Winchester. They did not chase another war windfall. They did not bet the firm on a transformation. They ran a well-made rifle company as a well-made rifle company, reinvested enough to keep the product honest, and passed it down intact. Boring ownership, it turns out, is a competitive advantage of its own, and in an industry littered with famous names that overreached and died, the Kenna family's refusal to overreach is a large part of why Marlin was still standing, and still respected, 8 decades after a $100 gavel. There is a Second World War folded into this long stewardship, and the way the Kenna-run company handled it is the quiet proof that the lesson of 1918 had been learned. When the Second World War came, Marlin again took on military work. It manufactured, among other things, a submachine gun known as the United Defense Model 42, along with other war contracts. But this time, the outcome was completely different. The company did the war work without betting its existence on it, and when peace returned, it slid back into sporting production without the near-death collapse that had followed the First War. Same temptation, same fire hose of government demand, opposite result. The difference was not luck. It was an owner who had bought the company out of exactly that kind of wreckage and had no intention of steering it back in. The Kenna family would hold the Marlin Firearms Company for a very long time, far longer than the founder's own family had. From that $100 auction in 1924, the Kennas would own and run Marlin for the better part of a century, through the Depression, through a Second World War, through the great post-war boom in American hunting and shooting, and into the 21st century. Under their stewardship, the company would finally settle into the identity it had been searching for since the founder's death. A stable, family-owned, moderately sized maker of good lever-action rifles, permanently second to Winchester in fame and sales, permanently alive because it never again mistook a boom for a business. And it was during this long, stable Kenna era that Marlin would build the rifles that outlasted everything, including, eventually, Winchester itself. The gun that would carry the company through the century was about to be born. And the obscure engineering decision Hepburn had made back in 1893, the one about which way the empty brass flew, was about to become the most valuable choice in the company's history. Chapter 9. The rifle that outlasted everything. Every long-lived company has one product that becomes the spine of the whole enterprise, the thing that sells year after year, decade after decade, through fashions and recessions and changes of ownership, quietly paying the bills while more exciting products come and go. For Marlin, that product had a number. It was the Model 336, and to understand why it mattered means following a straight line back to Lewis Hepburn and the flat top of that 1893 receiver. The 336 did not appear from nowhere. It was the direct descendant of Hepburn's Model 1893, refined across half a century of continuous production. The 1893 evolved into the Model 1936, which was quickly redesignated the Model 36, and then, in 1948, Marlin reworked the action once more, most notably replacing the older square bolt with a new round bolt that was easier to machine and to fit, and gave the result a new designation that would become one of the most enduring names in American firearms, the Model 336. It went into production in the late 1940s, and it never really stopped. In one form or another, the 336 would be manufactured for more than 75 years, and Marlin would build it in enormous numbers, more than 4 million rifles over the model's lifetime, by the company's own reckoning. 4 million. That is a staggering figure for a company that spent its whole life in second place. And it proves that permanent second place, in a market as large as the American rifle market, is an extraordinarily good business to be in. Marlin did not need to beat Winchester to build and sell 4 million of a single model. It only needed to be the excellent alternative, consistently, for 3/4 of a century. The 336 was the payoff of the entire Challenger strategy, not a knockout blow to the champion, but a steady, decade after decade stream of shooters who looked at the two rifles and chose the Marlin. By the reckoning of the firearms press, the Model 336 became the second most popular centerfire sporting rifle ever made in America, behind exactly one gun, the Winchester Model 94. Read that ranking carefully, because it is the entire story compressed into a single line. Second most popular, behind the Winchester. Even in its greatest commercial triumph, the rifle that carried Marlin across the whole of the 20th century finished exactly where the company had always finished. One place back, in the shadow of the same rival, selling magnificently and still selling second. It was the best kind of second place a company could possibly have. It was second place all the same. And now the thing planted back in Chapter 3 pays off. Remember Hepburn's decision, made in the 1890s for reasons of strength and weather? The solid top receiver and the side ejection, throwing the empty brass out the right side instead of straight up. For 50 years, that had been a modest selling point, a cleaner action, hot brass away from the face. Then American hunting changed. In the decades after the Second World War, the telescopic sight went from a specialist's accessory to standard equipment. Ordinary hunters began mounting scopes on their deer rifles as a matter of course, because a scope let a shooter place a bullet with a precision that iron sights could not match. And here, the two great lever-action rivals diverged in a way that no amount of brand loyalty could paper over. The Marlin, with its flat-topped, side-ejecting receiver, offered a clean, solid platform right on top of the gun, the perfect place to mount a scope, low and secure, directly over the bore. The Winchester Model 94, the most famous lever-action in the world, ejected its empty cases straight up out of the top of the receiver, right through the space where a scope would have to sit. Winchester's most iconic rifle could not easily take a top-mounted scope, because its own ejection threw brass into exactly that spot. The Marlin could. Marlin even leaned into the advantage, drilling and tapping its receivers at the factory so a scope could be bolted straight on. Consider what that means. A decision made by Lewis Hepburn in the early 1890s, for reasons that had nothing to do with optics because practical telescopic sights for the common hunter barely existed yet, turned out 50 and 60 years later to be the single feature that let the Marlin 336 fit the way modern Americans wanted to hunt, and left Winchester's champion awkwardly behind. The side ejection that Marlin advertised in 1893 as a way to keep hot brass out of the shooter's eyes became, in 1958, the reason a deer rifle could wear a scope. That is what a good structural decision looks like across a long enough timeline. It was made for one reason, and it paid off for a completely different one, decades after the man who made it was gone. The 336 was not Marlin's only evergreen. There was also the little Model 39, A lever action chambered for the small 22 rimfire cartridge descended from designs reaching back to the turn of the century, and it earned a distinction few firearms anywhere can claim. It became one of the longest continuously produced firearms in the world, a rifle whose lineage was manufactured, in one form or another, across more than 100 years. Serious shooters prized the 39 for exactly the quality the Ballard had established at the very beginning: accuracy. The company that started by making a single-shot target rifle superbly well was still, generations later, making the finest lever-action .22 in America, and shooters knew it. There was more to the Evergreen line than those two rifles. In 1969, deep in the Kenna era, Marlin revived the Model 1894 designation for a new lever action built on the same family of actions, chambered for handgun-class cartridges like the .44 Magnum and the .357 Magnum, and it too settled in for a production run measured in decades. The .336 itself was offered in the chamberings hunters trusted most, above all the .30-30 Winchester, the cartridge that carried its rival's own name, and the .35 Remington, named for another competitor. That detail is a small, permanent reminder of the cartridge trap the company never escaped. Even its most successful rifle, in its most popular chambering, fired a round named after Winchester. Between the .336, the revived 1894, the Little 39, and the big bore 1895, Marlin covered nearly the entire useful span of the lever-action rifle, from the .22 rimfire a child learned to shoot on to the .45-70 that could stop a bear. It was a complete, coherent, and unusually stable product line, and almost all of it traced directly back to Hepburn's action of the 1890s. The company had found its catalog, and it had the rare discipline to leave a working thing alone. Together, the .336 and the .39 gave Marlin something priceless: products that did not need reinventing. Year after year, the company could build essentially the same excellent rifles, sell them to a steady stream of hunters and shooters, and turn a reliable profit without betting the enterprise on anything. After the near death of the machine gun boom and the $100 auction, this was precisely the kind of business the Kenna family wanted: boring, durable, and profitable. The rifles that had been designed in the 1890s and refined in the 1940s would carry the company across the entire second half of the 20th century. The quiet decades, it turned out, were the profitable ones, and they would last, under the same family, for the better part of 90 years, right up until the moment the family decided it was time to sell. Chapter 10. 86 Years of Boring. From the $100 auction of 1924 until late 2007, the Marlin Firearms Company stayed in the hands of the Kenna family. That is, roughly 83 years under one family's ownership, and extended to the closing of the New Haven area operations, it approaches 9 decades of continuity. In an industry that chewed up famous names and spat them out, in the very industry where Winchester itself would change hands, stumble, and ultimately lose its own factory, Marlin under the Kennas did something almost radical by being utterly unremarkable. It just kept making rifles. The strategy, if it can even be called that, was consistency. The Kenna-era Marlin did not chase military fortunes. It did not overexpand into booms. It did not bet the company on radical new products. It made lever-action rifles, the .336, the .39, the big bore 1895, and a line of solid, affordable bolt-action and rimfire guns. And it made them steadily, and it sold them to American hunters and shooters who wanted a good rifle at a fair price. The company built a particular reputation as the maker of an honest, capable, blue-collar deer rifle. Not the most expensive, not the most famous, but genuinely well-made and genuinely accurate, the rifle a working hunter could afford and trust. There were real innovations along the way, but they were the kind that improved the product rather than reinventing the company. In 1953, Marlin introduced what it called micro-groove rifling, a barrel design that cut a larger number of shallower grooves into the bore than the traditional method, which the company promoted as delivering better accuracy. It patented the approach and built it into its rimfire barrels and, over time, much of its line. Microgroove is a perfect example of the Kenna-era instinct. It was a genuine engineering improvement, aimed squarely at the accuracy reputation that had defined Marlin since the Ballard, and it reinforced what the company already was rather than trying to make it into something else. The clearest proof of the entire Kenna-era formula was a humble little rifle that most people have never thought about twice, and that quietly outsold nearly everything else in the industry. In 1960, Marlin introduced the Model 60, a simple, inexpensive, semi-automatic rifle chambered for the small .22 rimfire cartridge, the kind of gun a family buys for a teenager, for shooting cans and small game, priced so low that almost anyone could afford one. It was not glamorous. It was not a lever action. It carried none of the frontier romance that clung to the .336, and it became one of the best-selling firearms of any kind in the history of the world. The Model 60 stayed in continuous production from 1960 all the way to 2020, 6 unbroken decades, and across that run, Marlin built more than 11 million of them. 11 million rifles, from a single, humble design, sold a handful at a time to ordinary families year after year. There is no cleaner illustration of the whole Kenna philosophy. The company did not grow rich on the famous gun, or the exciting gun, or the gun that finally beat Winchester. It grew rich, quietly and enormously, on a cheap little .22 that it simply never stopped making and never needed to change. Boring, in the Marlin story, was not a weakness. Boring was an 11 million unit business. This is worth dwelling on, because it runs against almost everything the culture celebrates about business. There is no dramatic story here, no bold pivot, no visionary reinvention, no bet the company gamble that paid off spectacularly. For the better part of a century, Marlin's great achievement was that it did not do anything stupid. It stayed in its lane. It made the rifles it knew how to make, sold them to the customers it understood, avoided the debt and the overreach that had nearly killed it in the 1920s, and let the compounding of steady, unspectacular years do the work. By 2008, the company was able to mark the production of its 30 millionth lever-action rifle. 30 million guns, built by a company that never once was number one, accumulated the way such totals always accumulate, not in a burst, but across decades of just showing up. The contrast with the rest of this story could not be sharper. The machine gun boom, the most exciting thing that ever happened to the company, nearly destroyed it. The 86 years of boring, the least exciting thing that ever happened to it, built a firearms institution and made a family's fortune. Excitement, in the Marlin story, is the warning sign. Durability wears a very plain face. And yet there is a hard truth folded inside this long, stable success, and it points directly at what came next. A privately held, family-owned company that runs a steady, moderately profitable business for generations is, from a certain financial point of view, an underused asset. It is not extracting the maximum value from the brand, the market position, or the manufacturing base. It is simply running a good business well and being satisfied with that. In the modern economy, that kind of company has a name in certain circles. It is called a target. Because everything that made Marlin admirable to a customer, the long tenure, the trusted name, the loyal following, the profitable evergreen products, also made it attractive to a buyer who looked at that steady business and saw value that could be, in the language of finance, unlocked. A famous American gun brand with a century of goodwill, a stable of iconic products, and a family owner who might, at the right price, be willing to sell. To a certain kind of investor building a portfolio of firearms companies, that was not a heritage to be preserved. It was an opportunity to be acquired. In December of 2007, after more than 8 decades, the Kenna family sold the Marlin Firearms Company. And the buyer was not another family, not a gunmaker looking to steward a legend. It was part of a private equity-backed roll-up assembling the great old names of the American gun industry under one corporate roof. The 86 years of boring were over. What came next would be dramatic. And in this story, drama has never once been a good sign. Chapter 11. The Roll-Up. In December of 2007, the Marlin Firearms Company was acquired by Remington Arms, and behind Remington stood a much larger structure that is the real actor in this chapter. Remington had itself been bought by the private equity firm Cerberus Capital Management, which was in the process of assembling a portfolio of storied American firearms brands under a holding company that would come to be known as the Freedom Group. The plan was a classic roll-up. Gather up the great old names of the gun industry, Remington, Marlin, and others, into a single large enterprise, consolidate their operations, capture the efficiencies, and build something greater than the sum of its parts. On a spreadsheet, the logic was clean. Marlin was a respected brand with strong products and a loyal customer base, but as a standalone family company it was, in the eyes of the acquirers, leaving value on the table. Fold it into a larger firearms conglomerate, and a parent could rationalize the manufacturing, share the overhead, combine the distribution, and run the whole thing with the discipline of professional management and the scale of a major corporation. This is the core promise of every roll-up in every industry, that consolidation creates efficiency, and that a big, well-run parent can operate a collection of acquired brands better than each could operate alone. For a company like Marlin, though, that promise ran into a problem that spreadsheets are notoriously bad at capturing. Marlin's value was not really in its brand name as an abstract asset, transferable and independent of how the guns were made. Its value was in the guns themselves, and specifically in the fact that they were well made. Recall the cartridge trap from earlier in this story. Marlin, unlike Winchester, had never had the luxury of locking customers in with a proprietary cartridge. Its entire competitive position rested on one thing and one thing only, that a Marlin was a better-built rifle than the alternative. Take that away, and there was no reason to buy one. The quality was not a feature of the product. The quality was the product. And Marlin's quality was not an abstraction that lived in a logo. It lived in a specific factory in New Haven area, Connecticut, staffed by a specific workforce that had been building these particular rifles, with their particular quirks and tight tolerances and hand-fitted parts, for a very long time. The Marlin lever action is, by the standard of modern manufacturing, a difficult and fiddly gun to build well. It carries design DNA from the 1890s. It relies on skilled assembly and careful fitting. The knowledge of how to build it correctly was not written down so much as it was held in the hands and habits of the people who did it every day, and in the specific tooling they used. The roll-up logic did not, and perhaps could not, see that. To a consolidator looking at a map of factories and a portfolio of brands, a plant in Connecticut building rifles was a cost center that could be closed, its production moved to another facility elsewhere in the corporate footprint, with the savings dropping straight to the bottom line. The brand would come along. The tooling could be shipped. The product would still say Marlin on the side. On the spreadsheet, moving Marlin production out of its old plant and into the larger corporate manufacturing base was simply an efficiency to be captured. What the spreadsheet could not price was the thing that actually made a Marlin worth buying: the accumulated, embodied, unwritten skill of building a 100-year-old design correctly. The machines can be shipped. The brand can be moved. The drawings and the specifications can be transferred. But the workforce that knew, from decades of daily practice, exactly how to fit these particular parts into these particular actions, that does not fit in a shipping crate. And a company whose only competitive advantage is that its product is well made is uniquely, fatally exposed to any decision that separates the product from the people who knew how to make it well. So the acquisition set up a collision that had been implicit in Marlin's business model since the very beginning, since the moment the company chose to compete on quality rather than on cartridge lock-in. For over 100 years, that choice had been a strength, the thing that kept Marlin alive and respected in the shadow of a more famous rival. Now, in the hands of an owner that saw the brand as portable and the factory as a cost, that same choice became the company's point of maximum vulnerability. Everything Marlin was dependent on being built by the people who knew how to build it. And those people were about to be told the work was moving without them. The efficiency was about to be captured, and the quality was about to be lost. The gun world would give the result a nickname, half a joke and half an epitaph, that told the whole story of what happens when a heritage rifle meets a spreadsheet. They called it the Remlin. Chapter 12. Remlin. When the new owners moved to consolidate manufacturing, Marlin's Connecticut operation was shut down. The North Haven plant, the home of Marlin production, was closed around 2010 and into 2011, and the manufacturing of Marlin rifles was relocated to other plants within the corporate empire, most notably Remington's large facility in Ilion, New York. The efficiency logic of the roll-up was now being executed in the real world. The cost center in Connecticut was eliminated. The production was moved. The brand came along, as planned. The skilled workforce did not. This is the moment the entire century-long strategy of the company came due, all at once. Moving the production of an intricate, heritage lever-action rifle to a new factory with a new workforce is not like moving the production of a simple, modern, machine-made part. The Marlin design, with its roots in the 1890s, demanded hand-fitting and specialized know-how that the workers in New Haven had accumulated over careers, and that the new plant simply did not have on day one. The tooling could be trucked from one state to another. The tribal knowledge of how to make these guns right could not. As people close to the situation would put it afterward, these guns were tricky to build, and the trickiness lived in the hands of the people who had been left behind in Connecticut. The result was a quality collapse. The Marlin rifles that came out of the new production arrangement in the early years developed a reputation, deserved or not in every individual case, but widespread and damaging, for problems that the old Marlins had never had. Fit and finish issues. Function issues. The kinds of flaws that a company selling on quality, and only on quality, absolutely cannot afford. And the shooting public, which had always bought Marlins precisely because they were well made, noticed immediately and reacted without mercy. The market delivered its verdict in a form so precise it belongs in a business textbook. On the barrel of a Marlin rifle, the older guns made before the Remington takeover carried a particular stamp, the initials JM standing for John Marlin, the mark of the traditional Marlin production. The rifles built after the move did not carry that mark, and so buyers, hunting for the quality they trusted, began to distinguish the two eras by that stamp. A pre-takeover, JM-stamped Marlin came to command a premium on the used market. The later guns, from the troubled new production, were nicknamed Remlins, a blend of Remington and Marlin, and it was not a compliment. Think about what that JM stamp premium actually represents. It is the market putting a dollar figure on the exact thing the spreadsheet could not price. Two rifles, the same model, the same design, the same brand name on the side, the same cartridge, differing only in who built them and where. And buyers were willing to pay measurably more for the one built by the old workforce in the old plant. That price gap is the precise value of the embodied skill that the roll-up had treated as free and portable. The consolidators had assumed that Marlin's quality lived in the brand and the tooling. The used gun market proved, in hard cash, that it had lived in the hands of the people in Connecticut all along. The practical reality on the ground was even rougher than the reputation suggested. In the transition, Marlin's product line was thrown into disarray. Models were suspended while the new plant struggled to bring them into production. Availability turned erratic, and a share of the rifles that did reach dealers arrived with exactly the kinds of flaws a quality brand cannot survive. Rough actions, misaligned sights, finish problems, the small failures that generate returns and warranty work, and, worst of all, word of mouth. For a company whose reputation had been built one satisfied deer hunter at a time across more than a century, the bleed was fast and hard to stop. A name for reliable quality takes decades to build and a very short season to spend. And the Marlin name was being spent at precisely the moment its new owner most needed it to hold. The consolidation that looked, on a spreadsheet, like the capture of an efficiency was, in the real world, the steady destruction of the single asset the whole acquisition had been meant to exploit. This is the cartridge trap, sprung at last, exactly as the logic of it predicted 100 years earlier. A company that had chosen, back in the 1890s, to compete on quality rather than on cartridge lock-in had built itself a magnificent strength and a hidden fault line. The strength carried it for a century. The fault line was this: the day the quality fell, there was nothing else holding the customer. Winchester, with its history of proprietary cartridges and its brand so famous the name meant the whole category, had a cushion of loyalty and habit to fall back on. Marlin never did. When the Marlin got worse, the only reason to buy one got worse with it. The thing that had made Marlin special for 100 years was the thing that had the furthest to fall. The damage to the brand's reputation in those years was severe, and it came at the worst possible time, because the parent company that had caused it was itself heading for the cliff. The Freedom Group structure, later reorganized as the Remington Outdoor Company, was carrying heavy debt from the roll-up strategy that had assembled it, and it was struggling under the weight of it. The consolidation that was supposed to create efficiency and value was instead producing a debt-laden conglomerate with a damaged Marlin brand inside it, and a business that could not sustain itself. The parent's troubles were not only financial. In December of 2012, after a mass shooting at a Connecticut school, the political and investment climate around the company's owner shifted hard. Cerberus, facing pressure from a large public pension investor that no longer wanted its money tied to the firm, announced that it would sell the Freedom Group. That was a decision driven by public and financial pressure rather than by any strategy for the businesses inside, and it proved difficult to execute cleanly. A straightforward sale did not materialize on the announced timetable. The ownership arrangement was reworked over the following years to let investors cash out, and the enterprise entered a stretch of instability at the very top. Consider what that meant for a brand like Marlin, a company that survives on carefully built quality needs. More than anything, a stable owner willing to invest patiently in getting the product right. What Marlin had instead was a debt-heavy parent that its own controlling investor was publicly trying to unload. The gap between what the brand needed and what it actually had could hardly have been wider. So the story arrives at a grim rhyme with its own past. Once before, a Marlin owner had chased something enormous, the machine gun boom of the First World War, overreached, and driven the company to a distressed sale. Now it was happening again, on a larger stage. An owner had chased the enormous promise of the roll-up, overreached, loaded the enterprise with debt, damaged the very asset it had bought, and was heading toward collapse. The parent that had broken Marlin was about to break itself, and the Remington Outdoor Company would go bankrupt not once, but twice, in the space of 2 years. Out of that second bankruptcy, Marlin would be sold one more time. And the outsider who bought it, the third outsider to rescue this company across its history, would finally get right the one thing the roll-up had gotten catastrophically wrong. Chapter 13. The Underdog Comes Home. The Remington Outdoor Company filed for bankruptcy in 2018, restructured, and then filed again in 2020. The second bankruptcy was the end of the road for the conglomerate as it had existed. Rather than survive as a whole, the company was broken up, its collection of famous brands auctioned off in pieces to a field of buyers who each wanted a different part of the wreckage. Marlin, the name, the designs, the machinery, the intellectual property, was one of those pieces. On the block once again, 96 years after Frank Kenna had bought it at a sheriff's auction for $100. The buyer was Sturm, Ruger and Company. In September of 2020, Ruger's bid for the Marlin assets was accepted in the bankruptcy proceedings, with the purchase reported at roughly $28.3 million. Ruger is one of the largest and most respected firearms manufacturers in the United States, and critically, it is a serious, engineering-driven gun company, not a private equity roll-up assembling brands on a spreadsheet, but a manufacturer that actually builds guns and understands, in its bones, what makes a good one. And here, the pattern that has run through this entire story completes itself for the third and final time. John Marlin, the founder, was an outsider to the rifle giants of his day, a pistol maker who came late to the lever-action business. Frank Kenna, the savior of 1924, was an outsider to the gun trade entirely, a businessman who bought a distressed company and nursed it back to health. And now Ruger, the savior of 2020, was an outsider to Marlin, specifically, a rival firearms maker acquiring a fallen competitor. 3 times across 150 years, the Marlin Company was created or rescued by someone who did not already belong to it. The outsider buying in has not been the exception in this story. It has been the rule. What Ruger understood, and what the roll-up never had, was the exact lesson the Remlin years had taught in such brutal fashion. The value of Marlin was not a portable logo. It was a well-built rifle, and a well-built rifle required getting the manufacturing right before selling a single gun. So Ruger did something that a consolidator chasing quarterly efficiencies would have found maddeningly slow. It took its time. Rather than rushing Marlin products back onto the market to cash in on the name, Ruger spent more than a year integrating the designs into its own manufacturing systems, re-engineering the production for its plants and its quality standards, and getting the guns right before letting them out the door. Production of the reborn Marlin line was established at Ruger's facility in Myodan, North Carolina. The care extended even to the small symbols. Marlin's traditional emblem had long been a bullseye set into the stock, and its rifles had carried, in the good years, that trusted barrel stamp bearing the founder's initials. Ruger, rebuilding the brand, introduced its own era markings, a new bullseye and a horse and rider motif drawn from Marlin's own history, signaling plainly that this was a new chapter under a serious owner, not an attempt to counterfeit the old one. It was the opposite of the roll-up's approach in every way that mattered. Where the previous owner had shipped the name and hoped the quality would follow, Ruger rebuilt the quality first and let the name follow that. The difference showed up exactly where it always shows up in this story, in the product. The early Ruger-made Marlins were met not with the dread that had greeted the Remlins, but with relief, and then with real enthusiasm, from a shooting public that had spent a decade mourning what the brand used to be. The first fruit of that patience arrived in December of 2021. The rifle Ruger chose to announce Marlin's return was the model 1895 in the big bore 4570, and stop, for a moment, on that choice, because it is the plant paying off across the longest timeline in this entire story. The 4570 lever gun was the exact niche Marlin had claimed back in the 1890s. The powerful big-bore cartridge that Winchester's famous rifles could not chamber. The ground the giant had ceded and Marlin had planted its flag on. 126 years later, out of bankruptcy and under its third outside owner, the very first Marlin the new company built was a modern version of that same big-bore 1895, firing that same 4570. The company came back to life, standing on precisely the ground it had first claimed, as an outsider chasing Winchester. Some strategic decisions do not just echo, they come all the way around. By the accounts of the shooting press and the buying public, the Ruger-built Marlins were good, genuinely good, with the fit and finish and function that the name was supposed to mean, the quality that the Remlin years had stripped away. The company that had sold on quality for a century and had nearly died when that quality was taken from it, once again had quality to sell. And it was being built in America, by a manufacturer that treated the difficulty of building it well not as a cost to be eliminated, but as the whole point of the exercise. Now set that outcome beside the fate of the rival this rifle spent its whole life chasing. Marlin, the perennial number 2, had fallen into bankruptcy, been sold for parts, and come back, reborn under new ownership, built in a new American plant, its quality restored, its most storied product back in production. Winchester's path had run the other way. And the contrast between where the two lever-action giants ended up is the whole reason this story carries the title it does. Because the champion did not come home. The champion went overseas. Conclusion. Outlasted. Here is the whole story, compressed into a single cold inventory. A pistol maker who came to the rifle business 20 years late. A bought design that built a reputation for accuracy. An engineer's decision about which way the empty brass flew. A flagship rifle chained forever to its rival's cartridges. A big-bore stronghold in the calibers the giant would not build. A founder dead in 1901. A machine gun fortune that nearly killed the company. A $100 auction and a $95,000 debt. A family that owned it for 86 unspectacular years. 4 million of one rifle. 30 million lever actions. A roll-up that treated skill as portable and was proven wrong in hard cash. A quality collapse with a nickname. 2 bankruptcies. And a rescue, at $28.3 million, by the third outsider to save the company in 150 years. The thesis of this story lives in the gap between 2 dates, and it is worth stating with precision, because the precision is what makes it true. On the 31st of March, 2006, The Winchester factory in New Haven, Connecticut, the plant that had built the rifles that won the West, in the city where Oliver Winchester and John Marlin had once been neighbors and rivals, closed its doors. The company that ran it stopped making the Model 94 and the Model 70 there. The Winchester name did not die. It is a valuable trademark, held today by the Olin Corporation, and firearms carrying the Winchester name are still made and sold. But they are made under license by other companies in other countries. The lever actions and bolt guns that carry the Winchester name today are produced overseas, notably in Japan. The most famous American rifle brand in history survives as a name licensed onto guns built abroad. The company, as a maker of rifles in America, is gone. The name lives on, an ocean away from the factory that made it famous. Now hold that beside Marlin. Marlin, too, lost its factory. Marlin, too, saw its quality collapse and its owner go bankrupt. For a few years in the early 2010s, it looked as though the perennial number 2 might simply die, gutted by the same forces that had hollowed out so many old American names. But Marlin did not end up as a foreign-built badge on someone else's assembly line. It ended up back in an American plant, built by an American manufacturer, its quality restored, its rifles once again worth the name on the side. The underdog came home. The champion did not. That is the sense in which the rifles outlasted Winchester. Not in fame, Winchester will always be the more famous name. Not in total sales, Marlin never once outsold its rival, and never will. But in the specific, concrete sense that matters to the story this whole video has told. The second-place American lever action, made by the second-place company, is once again being manufactured in the United States as a living product of a real gunmaker, while the first-place rifle is a licensed name on an import. The company that spent 140 years losing the sales race is still, in the way that counts most, standing on its own feet in its own country. The one that won the race is not. Restate the decisions, each as the problem it solved. The Ballard, bought to establish quality where no giant stood guard. The Hepburn action, engineered to be stronger and cleaner, and accidentally perfect for the scope age half a century later. The 1895, built to own the big-bore ground Winchester, abandoned. The 336 and the 39 refined into evergreens that paid the bills for generations. Each was the answer to a specific question about how a smaller company survives beside a larger one, and each answer worked. And restate the errors, each as a decision made once and paid for. The machine gun boom, chased into near ruin because a windfall was mistaken for a business. The roll-up sale of 2007, which handed a quality-dependent company to an owner who thought quality was portable. The plant closure that separated the rifle from the hands that knew how to build it, and cost the brand years of reputation and a nickname it did not want. Every one of those was a decision, made by named people under pressure, and every one of them had a cost that the company eventually paid in full. Why did the name survive when so many others did not? Because underneath the name there was always a specific, definable thing, a well-built lever-action rifle for the shooter who looked past the more famous brand to the better-made gun. That meaning was precise enough to be worth rescuing 3 separate times, precise enough that a serious manufacturer would pay $28 million out of a bankruptcy to own it, and then spend a year making sure the guns lived up to it. Winchester's name meant fame. Marlin's name meant a specific standard of build. And in the end, the specific standard was the more portable inheritance, because someone could pick it up, take it to North Carolina, and make it true again. There is a symmetry in the two endings almost too neat to believe, and yet it is exactly what the record shows. 2 great American lever-action names, born in the same small Connecticut city, rivals for 140 years. Both lost their original factories within a few years of each other. Both saw their names pass into the hands of larger owners. And then the 2 paths split for good. Winchester's name went to an ammunition company, and its rifles went across an ocean, built well, by capable hands, but built somewhere else. Marlin's name went to a rifle company, and its rifles came back to an American bench, built by people whose entire business is knowing how. One legend became a label. The other became, once again, a gun. If you want to understand how a company that finishes second for 140 years can outlast the one that finishes first, how a brand built on nothing but being well made can fall all the way to bankruptcy and still come home while the famous name sails overseas, Marlin is the case to study. It never won. It just refused, 3 times over, to stay dead. And that turned out to be the only victory that mattered.